They say you're too quiet, too intense, too much. And maybe you are, because when you speak, people stop, not always to listen, but to judge. The air shifts, smiles tighten, someone changes the subject. You weren't trying to stand out, you were just being honest. But in a world that worships appearances, honesty can feel like a weapon. You walk through life noticing things others ignore. The way people say yes when they mean no. The way the loudest voice wins, even when it's empty. You catch contradictions in conversations. You question traditions no one else dares to. And slowly, you begin to feel separate. Not better, just elsewhere. You're at a dinner party. Everyone's laughing about something, a show, a gossip headline, some joke that circles back to nothing. You laugh too. It's polite, but inside your mind is somewhere else entirely, asking questions no one's asking, wondering if anyone else even notices how hollow this all feels. Eventually, you start to wonder, is something wrong with me? But what if the problem isn't you? What if the world was simply not built for minds like yours? Arthur Schopenhauer once said, "A man can be himself only so long as he is alone." He wasn't romanticizing loneliness. He was warning us. The more clearly you see, the more alone you may become. Because most people don't want the truth. They want comfort and clarity. Raw, unfiltered clarity destroys comfort. This is the quiet curse of the deep thinker. Not because you try to be different, but because you can't help but feel everything too deeply. Think too far ahead. See too many layers at once. And that kind of mind, it doesn't fit. Not in casual conversations, not in meetings full of small talk, not in a world that rewards performance over presence. So you adapt, you nod, you smile, you simplify. Not because you want to, but because being fully yourself is too expensive. You've learned that depth scares people, that silence makes them nervous, that your honesty can be misread as arrogance. So you build a mask, a version of yourself that's easier to digest. But behind that mask, something grows heavy, a quiet sadness, a sense that no one really sees you, not the real you. And that weight, that ache of invisibility is not just emotional, it's existential. It's the feeling of living in a world that rewards noise but punishes nuance. You're not broken, you're just awake. You try to speak your mind carefully at first. You mention something that matters to you, a thought about mortality, about meaning, about how time feels like it's slipping away faster these days. But the room shifts. Someone changes the topic. Someone laughs awkwardly, and someone else checks their phone. You shrink back. Not because you're ashamed, but because you've learned the pattern. When you speak from the soul, people respond from the surface. And over time, that gap becomes too painful to keep crossing. So you stop crossing it. This is the paradox of intelligence, not the kind measured by tests or titles, but the kind that feels everything and questions everything. It's the paradox of seeing too clearly in a world that punishes clarity. Most people want certainty, not truth. They want harmony, not honesty. They want validation, not confrontation. And the more you question, not out of rebellion, but out of curiosity, the more you are pushed to the edges. Schopenhauer understood this. He saw that the sharpest minds are not celebrated. They are softened, blunted, or left alone. Because intelligence does not just solve problems. It disturbs comfort. It sees what others pretend not to. It holds up a mirror in a room full of people who don't want to look. That's why your presence can feel like a threat, not because you mean harm, but because you disrupt illusion. It's not just what you say, it's how you see. And that vision, piercing, unfiltered, makes people nervous, so they label you cold, arrogant, difficult, detached. But you're not any of those things. You're just tired of explaining thoughts that don't fit into sound bites. You're tired of censoring your questions. You're tired of feeling like your very presence is too much for the room. So you retreat, not out of weakness, but out of exhaustion. And in that retreat, you start to see something clearly. Maybe this isolation isn't punishment. Maybe it's protection. Maybe it's the space you need to stop deluding yourself and start becoming yourself. And maybe, just maybe, solitude isn't the absence of connection, but the beginning of a truer one. There's a strange kind of peace that follows once you stop trying to belong. Not the bitter kind, the kind laced with resentment or pride, but the quiet kind. The kind that arrives when you finally accept the truth you've been resisting your whole life. That some minds are not meant to blend in. You stop forcing conversation. You stop pretending to care about things that drain you. You stop performing smallness just to be accepted. And instead, you listen, not to others, but to yourself, to that still voice that's been buried under years of noise. At first, the silence is unsettling. It feels like absence, like loss. But slowly, it becomes something else: clarity. You begin to realize how much energy you've spent trying to be understood, how often you've shaped your thoughts to fit the moment, how rarely you felt seen, truly seen, without explanation, without compromise. And now, in this space of stillness, something unexpected happens. You don't feel empty, you feel real. This is what Schopenhauer meant when he spoke of solitude, not as loneliness, but as liberation. He believed that the truly intelligent are drawn to silence, not because they hate people, but because the surface exhausts them. He once wrote, "Great men are like eagles and build their nest on some lofty solitude." Not to escape, but to breathe. In solitude, you can finally let your thoughts stretch out. You can follow them all the way down, past the easy answers, past the safe ideas, into something deeper. Not because anyone is watching, but because you are. You begin to live not for applause, but for alignment, not to be admired, but to be at peace. And in that shift, something breaks open. The pain of being misunderstood softens because you realize being understood was never the point. Being true was. But truth, when lived fully, comes with a cost. It asks you to walk away from comfort. It asks you to let go of approval. It asks you to stand alone, not as a statement, but as a necessity. Because the more you align with your own values, the less you align with the crowd. You start to notice how often people trade authenticity for acceptance, how often they echo opinions, wear personas, follow scripts that were never theirs to begin with, and how exhausting it is to constantly bend yourself to fit into molds you never chose. That's when something inside you whispers, enough. Not in anger, not in defiance, but in quiet certainty. Enough pretending, enough performing, enough shrinking. You begin to reclaim your space, mentally, emotionally, spiritually. You start to ask harder questions, not out loud, not always, but within. What do I really value? What kind of life do I want to build? What am I no longer willing to betray just to be liked? These are not easy questions, but they are real, and they require a kind of courage the world rarely celebrates. The courage to be honest when no one else is, to walk a path with no map, to trust the sound of your own inner voice over the roar of the crowd. Schopenhauer knew this well. He didn't offer comfort, he offered clarity. He didn't believe suffering was something to be escaped. He believed it was something to be examined, transformed, understood. Because when you stop running from your mind, you discover its power. Yes, it may make you feel too much, think too deeply, question too often, but it also gives you something sacred: discernment, the ability to see what others miss, to feel what others suppress, to think in ways that don't follow the script. And while that path may leave you feeling alone, it also sets you free. You stop chasing the kind of connection that leaves you empty, the kind that forces you to smile through boredom, nod through nonsense, agree just to avoid conflict. Instead, you begin to crave something else: stillness. Not the absence of sound, but the presence of clarity. Not the loneliness of being unseen, but the freedom of being unfiltered. It's in this stillness that your thoughts begin to breathe. Ideas you've buried start rising again. Questions you silenced begin whispering, and the parts of you you've long hidden start coming home. This is solitude, not the version society fears, but the version Schopenhauer revered. To him, solitude was not a void, it was a forge, where your mind could sharpen itself without interference, where your soul could realign without noise, where you could finally stop performing and just exist. Modern life treats solitude like failure, like a space you only enter when something has gone wrong. But deep thinkers know better. They know that solitude is often where the most important work begins, because solitude does not dilute you, it distills you. You start to see patterns in your past, choices you made to be accepted, words you swallowed to avoid rejection, truths you hid just to keep the peace. And for the first time, you allow yourself to grieve, not with bitterness, but with understanding. You see how much of your life was shaped by a fear of being too much. And now you realize being too much was never the problem. You were simply in the wrong room. You don't need to dull your shine to make others comfortable. You don't need to shrink your thoughts to fit inside small minds. You don't need to translate your soul into a language that was never meant for it. Schopenhauer believed that a person's greatness could be measured by how much truth they could tolerate, not just about the world, but about themselves. And in solitude, you find the courage to face that truth. Even when it hurts, even when it isolates, even when no one claps, because the reward is not applause, it's authenticity. But authenticity is not glamorous. It doesn't come with trophies or applause. It doesn't get you invitations to every room. In fact, it may get you fewer. Because when you begin to live in alignment with your deeper values, you inevitably drift from the crowd. Not because you think you're better, but because your definition of better has changed. You no longer crave attention, you crave alignment. You no longer chase belonging, you seek resonance. You start to realize that the loudest voices often have the least to say, that popularity doesn't equal wisdom, that being surrounded by people doesn't mean you're truly seen, and slowly you make peace with being misunderstood, not as a failure, but as a sign you've stopped diluting your truth. This is where many turn back, where the loneliness feels unbearable, where the silence feels too sharp, where the path of depth feels like exile. But Schopenhauer offers something rare, not relief, but recognition. He doesn't tell you it will get easier. He tells you it will get clearer. He believed that those who think deeply often suffer more, not because life is cruel, but because awareness removes the illusion of comfort. He once said, "The more unintelligent a man is, the less mysterious existence seems to him." In other words, the more you understand, the more you see. Not just the beauty of life, but its contradictions, its impermanence, its ache. That ache is not a flaw. It's evidence that your mind has opened beyond survival. That you're not just living, you're noticing. And yes, it isolates you. Yes, it sets you apart. But it also grants you something rare, depth. A depth that cannot be faked, a clarity that cannot be undone. A presence that does not need to be loud to be real. And that's the quiet power Schopenhauer saw in solitude. The ability to live truthfully, even when it costs you everything superficial. Because what you gain in return is yourself. You begin to understand why so few walk this path. Not because they're incapable, but because they're afraid. Afraid of silence, afraid of their own thoughts, afraid of seeing through the illusions that keep the world spinning. It's easier to belong than to be free, easier to follow than to question, easier to nod than to challenge. But you've chosen something harder. You've chosen to see clearly, even when it hurts, to feel deeply, even when it isolates, to walk alone, even when the crowd whispers that you're lost. But here's the irony. They only call you lost because you've stopped walking in circles. Schopenhauer understood this kind of solitude not as defeat, but as refinement. He believed that suffering, when met with awareness, could lead to wisdom. That clarity was not the enemy of peace, but its source. Because when you finally stop trying to earn your place in rooms that don't value you, you create space for something else, for stillness, for alignment, for truth. You stop asking, "Do they understand me?" and start asking, "Am I honoring myself?" And that shift changes everything. You begin to build your life around what feels true, not what looks good. You start choosing depth over distraction, presence over performance, integrity over impression. It's a quieter life, yes, but it's also a freer one, because you're no longer waiting to be seen, you're practicing the art of seeing. You're no longer begging to be heard, you're learning to listen. You're no longer proving who you are, you're becoming it. And in that becoming, you reclaim something sacred. Not your status, not your reputation, but your soul. That is the gift of solitude. Not escape, but return. Not absence, but presence. Not punishment, but power. Eventually, you realize the loneliness was never the enemy. It was the invitation. The quiet space that asked you to meet yourself. Not the version shaped by fear or filtered for approval, but the one buried beneath years of pretending. And when you finally answer that invitation, something shifts. You begin to see beauty in places you once overlooked, in a single candle flickering at night, in the pause between two thoughts, in the way your breath rises and falls without needing permission. You no longer chase intensity. You begin to value stillness. You no longer crave noise. You start to protect your peace. The world might still label you too sensitive, too serious, too strange. But now, those labels don't land, because they're trying to describe a version of you that no longer exists. You're not here to convince anyone. You're not here to play a part. You're here to live truthfully, even when no one claps, even when no one follows. Schopenhauer called this the noble intellect, not noble by birth or brilliance, but by the strength to walk alone without becoming bitter, to keep thinking deeply without closing your heart, to feel the pain of distance and still choose authenticity, to stand in your own clarity, even when it costs you comfort. And yes, it will cost you. You'll lose certain circles. You'll be left out of certain conversations. You may even feel forgotten at times. But in that forgetting, you'll remember something far more important: who you are when nothing and no one is pulling at you to be anything else. And that is a kind of power the world can't take away, because it wasn't given by the world. It was built in silence, in solitude, in the sacred space between your questions and your truth. And when it's all said and done, when the world grows quiet and the applause fades, what remains is not what you built on the outside, but who you became on the inside. You're not here to be everything to everyone. You're not here to water yourself down to fit into places that were never meant for you. You're here to live in alignment with your values, your clarity, your presence. And yes, that path is lonely, but it's also luminous. Because the moment you stop performing for the world, you begin to connect with something the world can't offer. Truth, not the kind written in books or shouted in debates, but the kind you feel in your bones when you're finally still enough to hear it. You begin to see that being misunderstood is not failure, it's freedom. That being different is not a curse, it's confirmation. That your pain is not a weakness, it's a compass, pointing you not back to the crowd, but deeper into yourself. This is what Schopenhauer understood, that the cost of thinking deeply, of feeling fully, of living honestly, is often separation. But that separation makes space for something sacred, for solitude that nourishes, for silence that reveals, for a life that is not loud but real. So if you have ever felt too much, too quiet, too aware for the world around you, you are not broken, you are not lost, you are simply further along the path. And one day, maybe not soon, but eventually, someone will recognize the depth in your eyes, the quiet in your soul, the strength it took to walk alone without folding. And when they do, you'll know. You never needed to be seen by the many. You only needed to remain true to the one, yourself. That is the Stoic path. And you, just by choosing to walk it, are already free.